Thanks for joining us. My goal is that we're going to finish this book this week and next. So we've covered a few extra chapters, and I did want to raise up to you. I found half of this book like really helpful. It's a new book about Holy Week and like how Jesus actually fights nonviolently throughout. I'm happy to loan it. I almost thought we could read through it as a group next because there's some really interesting parts about it, about what that whip was like that Jesus chased people with, and about what palm branches mean. So there were some nice things. And again, I have it and I'll lend it out if you want it. But it ties into kind of where we ended up this week, starting with Holy Week. Because, in general, not a lot of people realize that there were two processions on Palm Sunday and that Jesus's was substantially different from the other one. Maybe that's not what we want to talk about. So I should probably just open the floor to see if there were things you wanted to talk about from these 10 chapters, either things that rubbed you the right or wrong way, or things like, hey, I didn't know that, or I wish I knew more, or wow, you're totally wrong about that.
See. Where did we start? How far back? I'm flipping through my book.
I think we started at 40.
Let's see. I'm just looking like where I underline things. So, and I haven't reviewed it since I read it, whenever. But I took that on chapter 42 called The Master. I don't quite remember what the scriptures were, but the last sentence in the reflection part on page 114, weave your life, both the honest and dishonest paths, into God's tapestry. So what you're saying, kind of bring our whole selves, I guess, the good and the bad, I guess, to the community, to God, offer up our whole selves. Is that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's this interesting, I took a class in seminary called Parables of Jesus, and we had to pick a parable and write like a 15-page paper or whatever it was, and I picked this one because the teacher had said there were two parables he didn't understand. This is the teacher. And the unjust steward is one of them, right? The unjust steward is accused of being dishonest. Mm-hmm. So then he practices dishonesty and the master commends him. Mm-hmm. And then there's this like commentary, like use worldly wealth to buy friends so that you can like have heavenly welcome. And it's sort of like, what? Like, that is so weird. Like, it really makes no sense. So I read, no kidding you, like 100 different Bible scholar interpretations on that parable, and none of them made any sense. I mean, I wrote a paper, I probably got an A- on it because I did all that research, but I didn't have an original idea. I put in that story that I heard a guy talk about this. He was a prison chaplain. And this I mean, it's just so amazing, right? You've already read it, but I love the story. He had to buy bookshelves or else his budget, he had money at the end of the year. He was going to buy it or get less budget next year. So he bought these bookshelves, they came assembled, and a guy said, give me like 2 blankets and 3 guys and I'll smuggle those bookshelves in. And he said, the priest said like, that's this parable, is to like, use your like the skills that got you into prison to smuggle things into like God's world. It was amazing. I don't even know what it means yet, like.
So you just never know. The skills that you have, the good and the bad, might be useful some way, in a good way. Is that?
I think so. It occurs to me like church is changing, and I'm a little bit scared how it's changing. I'm a little bit scared, but I also realize there's an opportunity. So it used to be like, hey, if you want to serve here, you have to do it in these 5 ways. So you have to be on the altar guild, or you have to be in this thing, or you have to do that thing. And now I think it's sort of like, well, maybe not everybody wants to do that, and maybe that's all right. Like, what do you do And how could you do it like to benefit the community in God's name? And there's people that do like weird stuff, like they brew beer, or they throw a really good shrimp boil, or I don't know, they know how to forge stuff. and so like, I don't know that we need a forging guild, but it is pretty cool that Steve Alexander turned some useless brass into these flowers that we put on the Lord's table when a baby's born. Like that's really cool. And instead of that being a one-off, like I wonder if that couldn't be like the regular story. Like you do this thing and then you did it to like lift up the people of God. Maybe that was a non sequitur, but like
but I think like, so a lesson could be that you just never know how these talents, or maybe not always, maybe we don't want to call talents the things that you do that are on the dishonest side, but you just never know how you can use, whether it's God-given or just from your experiences that you have from your God-given life, how you can use those to help someone, to help God, to glorify God, or to help someone that God has created. It's just in keeping an open mind, how we evaluate other people's skills as well. Okay.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if like part of evangelism, like real evangelism, isn't saying like, like you do this thing. And I wonder if you couldn't do this thing through our church to serve the community.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, like there's people who aren't interested in coming to church and they're interested in serving food. When we have the mobile distribution, that's great. I even have like a key leader here whose spouse is not interested in church, but loves doing church work days. Loves like, emptying gutters and trimming hedges and fertilizing plants, and has said like, we should do more work days because I would do them. It's sort of like, well, we need that. So yes, that's great. Like, so maybe the service isn't for you, but serving is for you. I don't know. And I guess none of that sounds super dishonest, but I think there's like not good and bad skills. There's just skills. And like, how do we deploy those skills?
That ties in for me with pray without ceasing. Prayer doesn't, and I think you addressed this in one of the chapters, prayer doesn't have to be words. Prayer is awareness of God and awareness of gifts that God's given you and how to serve others with those gifts. So just awareness is prayer. Serving is using whatever we have.
I think I increasingly feel like prayer has nothing to do with words. I think words are a scaffolding to get us into a new schema in which we realize like God is more present in us than we are in ourselves. And if you like devotional reading, there's this book called Never Pray Again. And the premise of the book is like, instead of praying that God's going to take care of sick people, like go take care of sick people. And instead of praying that like God will mend your relationship, like just go do that. And it's sort of like, oh, like that should have been a no-brainer, like what if we spent the time that we dedicate to just talking to actually like supporting the things we're asking God to do for us? And of course, the book is a little tongue in cheek. It's not saying don't use those words. It's saying the words are meant to push you out to help do that work. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. So again, the chapter about prayer and talk where you wrote about, what if we're not asking God for things, but instead we're answering God? And I hadn't thought of it that way. I've often heard word prayer is also an opportunity to build a relationship with God and have communication, in two-way. But just as far as thinking about answering something God is calling us to, through prayer.
That comes from a really cool book by a Jesuit theologian. I'm trying to remember. I think it's called "This Bread That Is Broken," and it sort of says biblically, like, God's the one who talks first. So prayer is not talking to God; it's talking back. That was a really cool image, right? Like, prayer is how we answer what God has already unleashed. I don't know why God doesn't answer. That's because when we pray, we answer.
And perhaps we're just not listening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Too busy talking.
Yeah, I'm not sure we listen very well. And if it's okay to say, I don't know if I'm going to do this at 10:30. I'm struggling with this, but I am taking a nonviolent communication mini course that's on Zoom, and it talks about ways in which we engage in things called other conversational responses instead of giving empathy. And I realized when I heard all those things, I was like, but what if what if your deeply seated core believes that other conversational responses are how you build relationships? Like advice giving, self-reflection, cheerleading, sympathy, joking. I think these are other conversational responses, right? Like, oh, that's happened to me before, or an evaluation, that must be really tough. Or you go, girl, like you can do it. Or who the hell do they think they are doing that to you? Like, I'm like, wait a minute. And advice giving is my favorite. Like, the way I grew up is you have a relationship when you give advice. And so, like, there's this really interesting thing of like, and you guys are probably healthy people, and I'm not even going to blame my parents for this. Just what I internalized was the way you build connection is by doing these things that actually don't build connection. And I realize it because when I say, like, I'm having a tough time with blank, and somebody says, well, you go, boy, something in me is like, oh, like there's no connection. But I'm so used to doing that as a way of building connection. And so, like, Darlene, I'd like to speak to it. Like, I don't know that I listen really well. Like, I think a lot of times I listen to relate myself, or I listen to say, like, how do I fix that problem? Or I listen to say, like, well, what do you need from me? Instead of, like, I hear you, and what I hear is your need for blank is not being met, or like you're celebrating that your need was indeed met and that you'd like to continue moving that way.
I guess I'm gonna have to reread the chapter where they talk about where those other forms of communication are not helpful, because I'm not remembering why those aren't always helpful. So I'm gonna have to go back.
I think they're helpful sometimes, Adele. It's just that they're not really deeply connecting.
Not connecting.
So, like, what they talk about in the NVC training is, imagine that there's a tube that's like a water bottle, and that represents the relationship between two people. And we both got a cloth that we're trying to communicate to the other person. But like, when those both are coming in the middle, they get clogged. And there's not a connection. So what they say is, the way that we clear the connection up is we make room to listen. And then once having heard, there's room for us to communicate. But if we're both trying to do this thing at the same time, there's not going to be connection, and there's going to be a jam. And sometimes these other conversational responses jam up the need the other person's trying to express to us. Because instead of it actually coming through, we kind of put a cap on the end. Mm-hmm. And I know this sounds tangential, but I do wonder whether we're empathetic in prayer with ourselves or with God. It's funny, like, I don't know if God needs empathy, but I'm not convinced I've like even tried to be empathetic with God as a way of prayer.
Mhm.
Again, I don't think we have to have a response. Most of us feel like we've got to say something. And sometimes people don't need us to say anything. They just need us to be there with them.
Yeah.
Just presence. Just hanging in there with them. And that's hard for us because we feel like we need to fill the space. But people need space, nothingness from us except our presence in order to process their feelings, or in order to feel their feelings, or even in order to feel connected to us through that space. And I acknowledge it's hard for us to do.
Well, I think what you said that's really interesting, right, is that like maybe that's the way God answers, which is why I often get frustrated when I pray, because I'm like, God, fix this thing yesterday. What do you want me to do? Answer me. Give me a sign.
And what we get instead is God's presence, which is so if we allow that to happen, just the presence, and we don't fill it with words, then that presence can be sustaining, can be fulfilling, can be supportive, can be comforting, because we're not alone. And that's a lot of what we're trying to accomplish with conversation, is connection. And that connection is not sealed, or it's broken because we fill it with words sometimes.
And I think maybe we get frustrated in prayer often because we're looking for something that is an other conversational response. And I think we get frustrated in prayer with one another because we are so used to getting those back. And we've started to think those are the things we're supposed to want. So we don't appreciate the other thing even when we have it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, nonviolent communication says there's a time for all that other stuff too. It's not like you have to be in NVC mode all of the time. But I think there's this rewiring rewiring in my core to say like, oh, that other thing is actually desirable. Mm-hmm. And that's a little bit of a conversion. Like I get it in my head, but I'm so programmed that prayer is about action or talking or requesting or fixing instead of just deep. And I'll tell you, even like, this is a terrible thing for me as a priest. When somebody's sick, I always like want to say, what can I do for you? And at my best, I'm able to say, look, you probably don't need me to do anything other than like pray and hold space for you. But part of me needs to ask, is there anything I can do? Because I like doing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we did read The Widow and the Unjust Judge, right? Where it's interesting, like, she just keeps showing up.
Right. As you mentioned in there, we don't know whether she is justified or whether she is in the right or wrong, but the point is about her persistence. And yeah. And how will, I guess, so the question is, so is God as the judge, is our persistence what is going to help carry us through in our either faith or our asking?
Yeah.
So then it comes back that yes, there is some value to asking, to persistently asking. looking to that parable.
And it's funny, right? Because like, what's the difference between being stubborn and persevering?
Mhm. It's hard to know.
It depends on the other person's perception.
Yeah.
Sometimes when we're just persevering, people label us as being stubborn.
Mhm.
If you're a woman,
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
there's the whole she persisted movement.
Mhm.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yes.
I'm reading this interesting book. This made me think of this about it's burnout. It's called Burnout. I can't remember. It's Burnout something else. And it's specifically written for women. But they talk about this idea of persistence and women persisting. And they like pulled on some studies about rats, actually, male and female rats, and like the idea of learned helplessness, and how women will persist, or I'm sorry, female rats will persist longer in like a situation than male rats do, which I thought was just kind of interesting. But I don't know. I think that's like I don't know how you describe it in rats, why that's the case in rats, but maybe like keeping their children alive, but just historically, women have had to keep persisting in order to be heard. Anyway.
I have
My
a really good
dissertation
friend.
looked at character traits in high achieving women, and specifically in terms of androgyny, male and female traits combined. And one of the key factors was persistence. And those factors, that persistence in high achieving women is seen as a positive thing for men, but is seen as a negative thing for women. So it depends on who's looking at the character trait of persistence.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it's interesting you say that, because just to bear it out anecdotally, I have a friend who was actually pretty high up, like an executive vice president, but consistently will tell me, I'm not that smart, but I am a worker bee. And I was talking to an engineer even just like 2 weeks ago who said like, yeah, so-and-so's not that smart. They're one of those worker bees. And it was funny how we prize different kinds of intelligence, or how we have to like put ourselves under the radar and say like, hey, so maybe I'm not the ideal person, but I follow through. It's sort of this like funny thing that happens. And I do think it happens a lot where, well, at least in my experience, this friend of mine who's female almost consistently puts her intelligence down, but lifts up her persistence.
And part of that is because attractive women are not perceived as being, no, smart women, what is it? Being smart is not an attractive quality in a woman for the general population.
Well, and then studies show how girls, when they reach adolescence, those who are very intelligent will start either hiding it or step away from accelerated courses.
Right.
But they need encouragement to continue on those tracks.
To be who they are.
To be who they are, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why it's funny in the story that it is not only a female, right, but a widow. Yeah, somebody who really is like culturally powerless.
Yes, there's no one to advocate for her, and so she has to.
And so the question in the story, right, is which one's God? I suppose God's not in the story, but truth be told, I mean, that's a possibility, but like maybe God is the widow who has chosen to be powerless, has chosen powerlessness, right? Like God doesn't make us convert. Sometimes I wish that would happen, but like maybe God's the one that just keeps showing up. There's this book a couple of us read called Proverbs of Ashes, and that's where the author goes in the end, is that God shows up over and over again, and like in the middle of abuse, God is like, please stop, please stop, please stop. But God does not make abusers stop, does not make them, but perhaps is always there pleading with them, whether they listen or not.
All right, new chapter. I marked, we put a big asterisk by, I'm not quite sure how the context, but I liked at the end of chapter 46 as a child, where it mentioned, what if we encourage risk-taking in adults, especially around grace, and affirmed messiness as an essential part of participating in anything. So I really like that part about taking risk and giving grace to other people, so even if it, you think, oh, maybe it probably won't go anywhere, or based on experience or whatever, but just taking that chance, reminding ourselves to just, what have you got to lose? Yes.
Yeah, Brene Brown has this skill she recommends. It's like intention setting. She calls it making a permission slip, where you take like a sticky note and you write, I give myself permission to blank. Right. And I'll tell you, for me, and I know this is like going to come across as like maybe a little bit, I could phrase this better, but I need to say this for myself. When I go to a conference, I need to give myself permission to waste my time, because conferences are usually a waste of my time. If I will give myself the permission to waste my time, oddly enough, it usually will not be a waste of time. So it's this way of intention setting, right? And I wonder if like that isn't a good skill to say, like, I give myself permission to waste my grace on this person.
Or take a chance, or, right, that you might lose it, but you don't lose grace. It's not something it's not finite. Well, in theory, it's not finite, but there are days, I guess, like patience, where we really only have a finite amount.
I quit praying for patience, and now I ask for peace. Because I'm not patient and I don't want to be. But while I'm waiting, I would like to have some peace. I don't want to accept having to wait. But peace while I'm waiting is, I can deal with that. And this is the great thing, right? It's like all of us have totally different brains and personalities. And so our permission slips are going to look really different. And of course, I know you can't waste time if you're present, but I have to tell myself you're allowed to waste your time, because that speaks to me. I say that to certain people and they're like, oh, Mike, you can't waste time if you're present. Like, I know that, but I need to tell myself it's okay to waste the time.
It's okay. That's easier to accept than the concept of you're not wasting your time.
Yes.
Just accept that you're wasting your time, but that's okay.
Yeah. Because it's the language of how you feel, right? I mean, that's it. Like, I can tell you, like, I get it. There's no such thing as wasting time, but it sure feels like I'm wasting my time.
Does anyone else get tired though of like dealing with other people, like, it's kind of exhausting at times, and I know that's like why we have a community and we come back on Sundays and we get nourishment and everything, but sometimes it's exhausting. I don't know.
I agree, Julia. It is exhausting. It's harder for me to work all day. I feel more tired at the end of the day if I'm working with people all day than if I'm working in the yard.
Yeah.
Physical labor is not as exhausting as the emotional labor of taking care of other people.
Well, it's part of that introvert extrovert dynamic. So I definitely, again, expend more energy being around people all day, and I replenish that energy by doing something by myself, working in the garden, going for a walk, but working in my own head, and I replenish that energy. And so got to find ways that work for you to replenish that energy, because no doubt we go back out there and deal with people again for whatever reason, our role, but we have to find ways to replenish it.
I think this is also like why alcoholics talk about just for today. Because when you think that you have to practice sobriety for the rest of your life, that is so damn crushing. That I'm going to have to do this for another 50 years. So like when you think about the long term of dealing with people, it is so crushing. So I think the question is like, what can I do today? What can I do today? I mean, I don't want to like overdo this, but it's really clear to me for today. If my spouse were to like get in a tragic accident or something, I am good to be single. I do not need to get remarried, because I could just use some time to myself, and I have a good marriage, but it's a lot of work, you know? And if I have to think like, oh, I'm going to have to do this for another 20 years, it's not great. It's not great, you know? And like I exercise really well. But if I start thinking like, oh man, I got to do 3 runs this week, and that's times 52, and that's 156, it's like, I don't have the energy for that. So I just have to like, just go today, you know? And like, I do think being with people, frankly, is a lot like that. And I'm grateful to hear that there's like actually like some chemical basis to that for men and women both. Like men actually have these chemical cycles that usually are over like 3 months instead of 28 days. But like there is this natural rhythm where like, you know, it's sinusoidal and hopefully it comes back up. It's hardest when it's like does not seem to be hitting that inflection point, right? And that's where, to me, it's really important to say like, oh, if it keeps going like this, I'm going to jump off a bridge. Instead, I've got to be able to say like, just today, this is just today, this is it today.
And to give ourselves permission to feel that way.
Yeah.
We don't have to feel guilty, because it's a normal depletion of energy, and being gentle with ourselves, being accepting of ourselves, gives us permission to take a nap, or Adele to stay by ourselves in order to replenish. And this ties in with the chapter on as a child also, the statement at the end, and what if we looked at ourselves as children of God, especially in our weakness and frailty. If our kiddos get cranky and tired, we allow them space to take a nap, or we encourage them to take a nap. So if we can look at ourselves as children of God with frailty and weakness, but I don't see this as a weakness, but it's a need. Our needs are okay. And so if we take care of ourselves as we would a child, or as God wants us to take care of ourselves.
I think that even extends to throwing tantrums. I mean, I'm going to tell you, I was in a tough meeting this week, and I knew before I went to the meeting, I was not in a good headspace. And I tried to give myself a lot of room. And sure enough, I did not succeed in the meeting. Somebody said something that touched this spot, and I was not super nice about it. And I was talking to my spouse later, and she said to me, and this is particularly for women, well, that's because we don't have any culturally acceptable way of expressing anger. You're like in Italy, you yell, like that's just what you do. You yell, and then like you eat some spaghetti or whatever you do, right? like you do that. And it doesn't mean you're not friends. Like you have a container to go ahead and yell it out. And we don't have that container. So I often, when I find myself like, I don't know what to do, and then I express it, I feel like crap, because look, like I've expressed anger and I'm not supposed to do that. And hey, maybe there's some other ways I could do that. Like I could leave the room and like actually just yell, or like, I don't know, something. But I, you know, like it's only happened 2 or 3 times where my daughter's been possessed by Satan and had like an absolute tantrum. I mean, like one time, thank God she was in the car seat and she couldn't unbuckle it. And I was not unbuckling that seat. She was like, ah, like the Tasmanian devil. And it's a good thing I don't have the exorcism right handy, because I would have done it. Like I would have exorcised those demons. Instead, what I did was I went inside and left her in the car so she could do that for about 2 minutes. And then I went out to check and she was still doing it. And I went back inside and I came out 2 minutes later and the spirit had departed, whatever unclean spirit that was. And she was reduced to tears. She's probably just tired, you know, but like I was able to leave and come back and, you know, like maybe I need to do that in my own anger sometimes. Instead of saying like, you calm down, you 4-year-old, like, why are you such a baby? Just, all right, go ahead. Just try not to hurt anybody while you're doing this.
One time long ago, I was in my own therapy session and I was confessing and I was so embarrassed. I was just so humiliated that I had to admit that I had gotten so angry that I threw a shoe across the room. And my therapist just was quiet and he just kind of frowned and he said, Darlene, sometimes we just need to throw a shoe. So even if I don't literally throw a shoe, I've given myself permission to occasionally get angry enough to throw a shoe.
I think that's helpful. And you just try to throw the shoe when there's nobody else in the room, right? I mean,
yes, right.
Or not throw the shoe at somebody, right?
Right.
That would
just
be cool.
Throw it across the room.
Yeah, it's the collateral damage. I mean, that, you know, as far as angry and lashing out at other people, that I guess we want to manage or contain in ourselves, but we do have to find outlets, healthy outlets, you know, for that anger.
I really appreciate the book. I think it's Come As You Are, which is a book about, I mean, really it's about women and women's bodies, but it talks about the stress cycle and completing the stress cycle and how there is like a biochemical thing. And so like when you find yourself in a stress cycle, you really can't just say like, okay, like there has to be some intervention for those, frankly, for those chemicals to go somewhere. And that's because in a moment of criticism or when there's a mugger, our brain does the same thing, which like releases all this adrenaline, cortisol, and you can't just tell yourself, go away. There's ways you can handle that, like through laughter or yelling or yoga or literally just running. Because like when a threat comes up, your brain wants you to run away from a lion or like fight it. So and she talks about these ways to complete the stress cycle. And like, I'm a big believer in self-control, but like, I don't think we can like defeat all of our chemicals, you know, without some other good strategies. So there's been some times in the last month where we've had some stress here at the place and I have had to like say, that is the lion. And now I'm going to run away from it, literally, and run 5 miles. And then it was like a little bit better. The lion was still there. It's just like, you know, like I'm not like running away from my yeah, anyway. When I was a kid and we were driving in the car and we drive past runners, my dad would always say, roll the window down and tell them they can't run away from life. And like it was such a ridiculous thing. But there's obviously there's truth to it. And like sometimes we run into life by completing the stress cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Burnout book I mentioned is, I think, written by the same person that wrote that book. I haven't read that one that you mentioned, but it's like she and her sister wrote this one.
I so wish I. Do you know the Burnout book?
Let me Google it and I'll put it in the chat.
The one I'm mentioning is written by
Emily Nagoski.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll just send y'all the thing in the chat. But this is by Emily Nagoski and her sister Amelia. Anyway.
Emily and Amelia are the sisters' names?
Mm-hmm. here, I'll put it in the chat. It's specifically for women, and it's like, what is it called?
Oh, Amelia.
Amelia, I'm sorry. Burnout, the secret to unlocking the stress cycle. But it has a whole chapter about that stress cycle and completing it, which I think is super helpful.
That book, Come As You Are, I wish I'd read in high school, particularly as a man, and thinking about like, because the book is actually about like human sexuality and sexual development. And it just would have been really, really helpful, particularly with all the baggage I had as an evangelical to like, anyway.
I haven't read that one. I don't have to read it.
Thank you.
Did anything else stand out for us?
Well, I mean, it wasn't really a huge part of it, but it's going back to that, the master one. And it's just the idea of idolatry. I don't know, just that idea in general is in my mind. I don't really have anything else to say about it other than I don't know. How do you, like you say, can you serve God and politics at the same time? God and career, God and Uber parenting. I don't know, it's just something to think about. I think it's something that I struggle with, a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, I think at least you and I are at this age where it's sort of like, I don't want to speak for you. For me, what I learned was work really hard and your job is really important, and job is really important in my life and in my spouse's life. And I'll tell you a couple of times here, like I've spent lots and lots of time here doing a lot of work. And then I've seen some things erode that were beyond my control. And it's like, dang it, like I spent a lot of my mental health on that thing and now it's gone. And it was out of my control. And that's affected like the quality of my life and the quality of my family life. And like, maybe there's a different way to do this work. Like, you know, like maybe I you know, like, again, I've got workaholic and professional minded like parents, and I do that. And this job is really easy for that to happen, where like, I don't have any of my own time because I'm always on call. And what are the consequences of living that way? And my spouse is a professional person, and like, is she going to be an equity partner, or is she going to be like some other kind of partner? And you know, like she works at a nice family friendly firm, and she only has to bill 40 hours a week, which means working 50 hours a week. And like, that's if she doesn't have any vacation. And like, wow, we went to school a lot to be slaves to our careers. Like that's, because at the end of the day, if she doesn't do her job, she'll get fired. I mean, there's not like any like, there's not like grace afforded. It's like a machine. And that balance is, I just think work-life balance is really, really hard. And parent life balance is really, really hard. Like I, in some ways, measure my own value based on like how my child behaves sometimes. And because you care so much about it, like it's hard not to. And yeah, I mean, it does. I don't think it means like, I guess the question is not like, what do you choose to work at, but like, where ultimately is your heart?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think like identifying your values and like what is valuable to you, and then also within your family, and sort of trying to make decisions based off of that is really helpful, but also really hard Because I think a lot of my values kind of go against what is like valuable to our society, I guess.
Yes.
And so it's hard.
And it's a funny thing, right? Like if you think about, like if you're a drug addict, that addiction is viewed as socially unacceptable. But if you're a workaholic and perfectionist, that's viewed as socially acceptable because it results in some product in the end. And so it's strange how we'll socially tolerate things that are just as bad for our brains and quality of life. And we all live into that sort of stuff. And I still am really a big fan of like working hard. And I don't want that. I don't want to lose that. And I think there's this interesting thing Brene Brown talks about is like the hook of perfectionism is we're afraid if we let it go, we'll become lazy. And that's the thing we're most afraid of. We don't want to be lazy people. So like that allows us to like hang on to that workaholism as if there's only two ways to be. And I have to admit, like, I get it. When home life is hard, I want to escape in work. Because like I'm effectively doing something. Like, look, I'm all bothered, but like I did a thing, you know, like, and it's so much harder just to sit there and like seethe with anxiety, because I don't have anywhere to put that.
I haven't read this book, but it made me just think of what you said. But there's a book called Laziness Does Not Exist. Has anyone heard of that? A friend recommended it to me, and I should check it. I haven't read it yet, but I'll put it in the chat too. She said it was good.
I'm going to have to go.
Thank you for joining.
And so we read the last 5 chapters, discuss the last 5 next week, and then prepare for a fight like Jesus for the week after.
No, I don't know. I don't know
Okay.
if we should. I don't know if we should do that one or not. I don't know. I like divided on it. Like,
We'll just wait to hear what.
yeah, I'll tell you. And this is recorded, so if you're interested, because we covered it in this book, I'll just go ahead and mention what I thought was really interesting about this book. And Adele, you got to go out, and I get
Yeah,
it.
I better go. I'd love to stay.
This is recorded, so if you want
Okay.
to,
Good point. I'll do that.
yeah.
Bye-bye.
This thing about Jesus making the whip has always kind of bothered me. And the analysis this guy does is that the whip is made of like rattan, which means it's like not a very good whip. Like if you tried making a whip out of rattan, it wouldn't do much. And so ultimately what this guy researches is that rattan thing is not for people, it's for the animals. And you put it on the ground and the animal, it's like it's a way of herding. And so Jesus is driving the animals out of the temple, not the people. That's helpful for me, actually, to think through, not because I necessarily need to think of Jesus as a pacifist, but the idea of him whipping people is like off of my understanding. And I like, whatever, I'll still hold space for that idea that's like disconcerting to me. But to me, it's interesting to think he's driving these animals out. And then in some ways, he's doing that to make room for Gentiles to come to the temple because the animals were occupying so much space and being sold at such a premium price that, and there's some research about charging a golden dinar for a dove, and that's like a poor person's offering, that this is part of what Jesus is like concerned about. It was helpful for me to have this reminder that palm branches were like a sign of the Maccabean revolt. And so when people laid palms down, it really was a sign of revolution and like you taking up arms, but that the donkey is a countersign to that. Because again, a donkey has no military advantage. It's like a handicap. So to think through like some of the ways in which peace is implied are interesting to me. There's more to the book than that, but I did appreciate the bit about the chords, quite honestly, and what those could be like. The other thing, right, is if Jesus was chasing people with a whip, I mean, there were soldiers garrisoned in the temple, and they would have probably arrested him then and there, because Jerusalem was always a time for rebellion during Passover. I don't know. The other thing the author did that we heard last week in church was he compares the woes to the Beatitudes. So like the woe is not like you're going to hell, but it's an urge to repent, and it's an urge to grief, because instead of being poor in spirit, you've sold the poor into bondage. Instead of practicing peace, you've led people to the gates of hell. Instead of being persecuted, you have persecuted other people. So the author does this interesting comparison of the Beatitudes and the woes that were read last week. And the last thing he does that's a great reminder, when Jesus says, talks about the denarius, whose face and portrait is it? And he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things are God's. That word render could better be translated perhaps as repay. And it's Jesus says, whose image is on there, like he doesn't even recognize the guy's face. And the question is, that the author talks about us being made in the image of God. So what are you to repay? So whose image are you repaying, Caesar's or God's? I thought that was an interesting kind of frame for that dialectic. You will probably find more interesting things in the book than that if you choose to read it. And again, I'm happy to lend it out. But the whole frame from the book is that Jesus comes to Jerusalem and says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if only you'd know the ways that make for peace." As a frame for all of what happens in Holy Week, is that we don't know how to make peace. Instead, we know how to fight.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, everybody. I'm really grateful for your time. Carolyn, it's always good to see you. See everybody soon.